There are certain poems that become more important to me as life goes on. One such poem was written by the great cowboy writer Charles Badger Clark. It's a poem entitled The Married Man. I started reciting this nearly 20 years ago after hearing Randy Rieman recite it. At that time, I was a single man. The poem took on a deeper meaning for me when I got married over 10 years ago, and then even more so when my daughter was born nearly 6 years ago. I now have 3 children, and I love reciting this poem more than ever. This is The Married Man by Charles Badger Clark. There's an old part of mine who sits by his door and watches the evening skies. He sat there 1,000 evenings before, and I reckon he will till he dies. Poor feller. I reckon he will till he dies and hear through the dim, quiet air far cattle that call, crickets that cheep, and his wife singing their baby to sleep in the creak of her rockabye chair. Once we used to camp where the last light would fail, and the east wasn't white till we'd start. But now he's deaf to the call of the trail and the song of the restless heart. Poor feller. The song of the restless heart that you hear in the wind from the dawn. He's left it with all the good, free-footed things for a slow little song that a tired woman sings, and a smoke when his dry day is gone. Well, I've rode in and told him of lands that were strange where I drifted from glory to dread. He'd tell me the news of his little old range and the cute things his kid had said. Poor feller. The cute things his kid had said, and the way 6-year Billy could ride. And the dark would creep in from the gray chaparral, and the woman would hum, while I pitied my pal. 'Cause I thought of him like he had died. He rides in old circles, he looks at old sights, his life is as flat as a pond. He loves that old skyline he watches at night, but he don't seem to care for beyond. Poor feller. He don't seem to dream of beyond, nor the room he could find there for joy. Ain't you ever uneasy, says I, one day. But he just smiled at me in a pitying way while he braided a quirt for his boy. He preaches that I ought to fold up my wings, that even wild geese find a nest, that women and a woman are different things, and a saddle nap isn't a rest. Poor feller, he's more for the shade and the rest, and he's less for the wind and the fight. Yet out in strange hills when the blue shadows rise and I'm tired from the wind and the sun in my eyes, I wonder sometimes if he's right. Oh, I've courted the wind and I've followed her free from the snows that the low stars have kissed to the heave and the dip of the wavy old sea. Yet maybe there's something I've missed. Poor feller. Yes, maybe there's something I've missed, and maybe it's more than I've won. Just a door that's my own when the cool shadows creep, and my wife singing our baby to sleep when I'm tired from the wind and the sun. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Randy Rieman. If you haven't already, I'd recommend going back to the last episode and listening to the first part of my interview with Randy. Randy Rieman has a wonderful reputation for the rawhide reatas that he braids, and in the second part of my interview with Randy, I asked him to walk me through the process of braiding a rawhide reata. Here's Randy Rieman.
Rawhide is it can be anything. It could be a deer hide or an elk hide or a cow hide or a horse hide that has had the hair removed, but there's been no tanning process of the hide itself. So it's not leather. It's still the raw hide off the animal. And the material of choice for most things like reins and romal or a reata. A reata is just a catch rope made out of rawhide, and it can be 4-strand or 6-strand or 8-strand. I've even seen 12-strand reatas. The higher you go in the numbers of strands, the smaller they have to be, the more delicate and fragile they are. So the average using rawhide reata would be a 4-strand or a 6-strand reata, because those individual strands are husky enough to withstand quite a bit of pressure, and they need to be because you're going to rope a big old cow or a bull or whatever. So the process is taking the hide off the dead animal and then removing the hair from the hide and removing the excess flesh from the side that was next to the animal's body. So you got the hair side and the flesh side, and that process can happen a number of ways. You can scald the hide to slip the hair off, or you can throw it in a running stream and let the water sort of start to break down the hide. There's a little bit of a rotting process, but if you let it go too far, then everything's ruined, and if you don't take it far enough, you can't slip the hair off. You can scrape the hair off with a sharp object. Guys used to put a hide down on the ground and sprinkle ashes from the wood stove into the hair so it would grip a wooden paddle, and then they'd shove the hair off with that paddle. Whatever you do, it's labor intensive. A lot of guys use a lime solution. They soak it in a big vat for a certain number of hours, and that makes the hair slough off real easily, so you can clean that off. Then you have to wash the hide in fresh water and vinegar to return the pH balance in the hide back to where it should be. So there's a number of ways to remove the hair and to cure the hide, so to speak, or to get rid of the hair so you can use the hide. And then you go through a process of cutting string out of that hide. So let's say you have a big rectangle off a cow, and you start on the outside. I use a pocket knife or a little X-Acto blade now, and you literally cut by hand one long string that goes round and round and round the hide till you get to the center. And the big, nice cow that might have, say, a 30 square feet of hide, I can get maybe 700 feet of string out of there. But it's all one big long piece, and it's not consistently thick or it's not consistently wide. So there's no steady dimension in the string. It's cut by hand. Where the hide is stretchier, you cut wider. Where the hide is not so stretchy, you cut narrower, because you want as much string as you can get out of your effort. So across the hips and the back of the animal, the hide is much stiffer, and you would cut the string a little narrower. Along the neck and the flanks of an animal, you would cut the hide wider, because when you stretch it and it starts to dry, it's going to shrink at different rates. So for a reata, which is what I'm most familiar with braiding, you have to pre-stretch that string so that when you braid it, which is a real aggressive process, it takes a lot of pulling and pushing. So there's a lot of pressure on that string. I say string, it's really a little rectangle of hide. If you haven't pre-stretched it, then when you braid a reata properly, where it's up nice and tight, so the crosses are close together, you'll stretch it out of shape. And the idea is that all the strands of the hide be the same thickness and the same width. And if you don't pre-stretch your string, when you start to braid, because those hides are from different parts, there are sections of the string from different parts of the cow, they'll stretch at different rates, and then your braiding won't look very consistent. Your string might shrink too much, or it might not shrink at all in other places. So you have a hide off the animal, you've cut one round of string, and then you take that string, you take the best parts of that string, and you actually cut it to size, a certain size. And you have some tools that you use to do that with. A string cutter is just a guide and a blade that you can adjust the width for, and you pull that string through so that you get a consistent, let's say it's a 1/4 inch strip, 100 feet long, and you get 4 of those, and then you make sure that you have them the same thickness as well, because once again, the back and the hips of an animal are thicker than the neck or the flanks. So you run it through a splitter, just like a leather crafter would use to split leather down to the proper thickness. You do the same thing with a piece of rawhide. You split it down to the proper thickness. So if you want a reata, it might be 3/32 of an inch thick and 3/16 of an inch wide. That might be your target measurement. But if you're making something like Leland Hensley makes, these beautiful quirts with really fine string where there's 64 strands in a pattern, they might be the size of dental floss, literally. And so you have different tools that you use to cut that with, and you might use a different raw material. Like the belly from a horse is what the Argentinians braid with, because they make super fine string, literally like dental floss, and they make patterns with 120 strings in a pattern, and they braid those tiny little rawhide strips into these beautiful patterns. And when I make a reata, it's huge. It's like barge rope compared to what somebody would use for a bosal or for a little set of reins, or guys have made jewelry for years, bracelets or earrings or things out of real fine rawhide, finely braided, and it's quite beautiful, natural material. It's really lovely to look at, and it wears like iron, and the size of the string will be determined by the object that the braider's going to make. Bill used to use, if they lost a baby calf, if there was a premature calf that sloughed, whatever, he would harvest that hide, and then that reedy, it would be transparent, almost like thin paper, and Bill would cut that into button string. So he'd put these beautiful decorative buttons on his reins, and he would choose the piece of rawhide that would require the least amount of changing to get the object you wanted. So with a reata, I'd take very little off a cowhide, and I'd have the proper thickness. With a set of reins, you couldn't use a big cowhide because it's too thick, and by the time you got it down to the proper dimension, you've lost all the integrity in the string. So a baby calf hide would make little tiny dental floss string that would be strong and durable. You could never make a string that small and durable out of a cow or a bull, because it's already too big. So a little bit of making a nice rawhide object would be understanding what size string you're going to need and what animal would that come off of. If I wanted a real soft set of hobbles, I might use a butcher steer, because they got lots of fat in their hide, and their hide is young and it's real thick. If I want a good stiff reata, something that'll last a long time, keep its body for a long time, I want an old wore-out cow, something with zero fat left in her that's just kind of on her last legs. And so none of that is knowledge that I had. It's all knowledge that I got from talking with Bill and other braiders through the years. Brian Newbert's a great braider. Nate Wald is a great braider. Leland Hensley down here in Texas. They do museum quality collectible stuff. I do working stuff, and I like what I do. I make a real fine reata, and I'll match it up with anybody's but Bill's. And even though I learned from Bill, he had something I haven't figured out yet. And even when I braided my first reata, which was a great story in itself, and it was all under Bill's tutelage, there's about a 6-inch piece on that 110-foot reata that Bill braided, and I can take you right to it. I can show it to you. And it doesn't look like what I braided. It looks totally different. And he just he was 85, and his hips were worn out. He still had super strong hands. In fact, I was amazed sometimes. He didn't have a lot of flesh left on him. He was pretty much hide and bones, but he had these massively powerful hands. And he could take a piece of rawhide and test it and snap it, and there's no way I could break that piece of rawhide. I don't know how he did it. And Billy Askew learned to braid from Bill as well, and started with reata, which I did too, which is a big project for a braider for a first time thing. And Bill would say, I don't know what Bill did to get those strings those crosses so tight like he did. But he said, I just never could replicate what he was doing. And I can't either. I've made almost 60 of them now, and I've yet to make one that matched up with one of Bill's. I'm real proud of what I make. I think they're good, but his were great. There was just something about him. And I even used Bill's tools for a long time, thinking that I would match the angles that Bill got. And I used Bill's dimension and his advice. And I mean, he walked me through the whole thing, but he put something extra in there that I've yet to see anybody do.
Everything that Randy Rieman does is marked with integrity and skill, including his poetry recitations. I asked Randy when he first discovered poetry and how he came by his love for the spoken word.
I was working on the West Fork of the Madison when the first cowboy poetry gathering happened, and I'd heard about it. Thought it was super cool because I was aware of poetry from before that got started. I had left home, like I said, when I was 17, and I went back and forth a bit before I settled in Montana. But I love to read, and I didn't grow up in a house with books. My folks were both 8th grade dropouts, blue collar all the way. Dad worked as an auto mechanic all his life after he left his father's farm. And he left his father's farm under duress. And that's a story in itself. But in the end, he became a mechanic and spent his whole life as a mechanic, as a gasoline engine mechanic for a big agricultural feed entity, and then he worked on diesel trucks afterwards for the Mack truck dealership in the little town where he lived. And so Dad, he just didn't have a interest in or a knack for livestock, even though he'd grown up with them. I had no interest in mechanical things. Just don't interest me at all. I'd rather be covered in manure than grease any day. And so Dad helped us boys. I had a brother and a sister at home too. And Dad tried to give us enough skill set that we could fix the brakes on our cars and things. This was all pre-computer stuff, of course, and set the timing and, all that. So I had a little bit of skill, but it was nothing I wanted any part of. And so I wasn't around books much as a kid, and read enough things in high school and college to make good grades, regurgitate whatever it was that was necessary. I can't say I learned a ton of stuff, but I had read very little by the time I left home. And when I did, I was so fascinated with the West, and that was my destination, not just physically, but mentally too. And I started researching. I fell in love with poetry at an early age. Really, in 3rd grade, I can remember so clearly one of my grammar school teachers reading us the poems of Robert Service. And so right away, that just rung something with me. I loved the sound of those poems. And then not much took place with that, except I had those fond memories of these story poems. And And when I was in high school and college in 60s and 70s, poetry that was contemporary wasn't interesting to me at all. The academic poets didn't interest me. The sort of anti-establishment 1970s complaining poetry, which was most of what you heard, it just didn't interest me. I wasn't interested in that social aspect of that. And so there was no big thing there for me, except I loved stories and story poems and story songs. And I played music quite a bit in high school with some friends. And when I moved to Montana, I met a group of musicians who I continued to play music with. And it was largely bluegrass music and folk music, Doc Watson and Norman Blake and Del McCoury and Bill Monroe, and that's kind of the music I grew up on, and flat picking and playing fiddle tunes, and started going to the Winfield Bluegrass Festival when it first started way back in the 70s and early 70s. And so anyway, music was a big influence. My mother loved music, and she listened to great country music. I mean, Willie Nelson and Patsy Cline and, Hank Williams Sr. and Lefty Frizzell and guys like that. So there was always music in my life as a kid, and it wasn't pop music. It was subculture music in a way. But when I moved to Montana and I started researching the real West and reading Charlie Russell's books, and you bump into quite a few verses that Charlie wrote, and I found, I think one of the very first book of poems that I found was Horse Feathers by Johnny Rich, which was a good friend of Charlie Russell's, and that book doesn't have a lot of great poems in, but it's got a couple really great poems in it. And all of a sudden, here's all this Western storytelling, not written for commercial purposes, not produced and directed by somebody in Hollywood, but real guys, who wrote just for the sheer joy of the language and the fun of it. And I'm sure many of them hoped that they would make a living doing it. And so I started to find out about Charles Badger Clark and Bruce Kiskadden, and that was right at the time when I was really learning to be a cowboy as well. And I was really interested in historical books, Tough Trip Through Paradise, Andrew Garcia, We Pointed Them North, Teddy Blue Abbott, Log of a Cowboy, all of those, Helen Huntington Smith and Teddy Blue Abbott, and No Life for a Lady, Elizabeth Morley Cleveland. And I just couldn't get enough of that stuff. I didn't watch television. I went to movie house once in a while, but I read and read and read, and I found these great poems. And so it was just this extension of the music I already enjoyed, which was old-timey storytelling music. And here was this body of work that rose up from the culture that I was immersed in. And so I was putting things to memory, and just for my own entertainment. It was long before I had met Tom Dorrance, and Tom knew a ton of cowboy poems, mostly Bruce Kiskadden poems, and he learned them specifically just to keep his mind sharp. And he found that it was kind of engaging to, when he was helping people with their horses, if he could distract them and tell them a little story, a lot of times it took the pressure off the horse and the person. And so he would use those poems to help the horse situation. Tom used to talk about letting something soak with a horse. And to do that, you have to get out of the actual stress of learning. And he probably knew more about the pharmacy in a horse's brain than he realized, but he would talk about letting what you had exposed the horse to soak in, and that required a recess. Not a vacation, but a recess. And so Tom would use those poems as a recess for the horse and the person, take the pressure off the situation. And so it wasn't that Tom wanted to run around and tell people poems. He just liked the poems, but he used them for a purpose that helped his teaching. That's just kind of one of those rabbit trails. But I find it fascinating that Tom had one of the most incredible memories that you could ever imagine. Bill did too. They just did not forget anything. And Tom worked at it by memorizing poetry. Bill didn't work at it. He still had the great memory, but not quite up to speed with Tom's. And I might tell you a story about their memory here in a bit. But for me, I can remember clearly hearing about the first cowboy poetry gathering and thinking I would like to do that. And so I found out what you had to do, and I sent in a cassette tape that I'd recorded in the West Fork of the Madison at that cow camp, 3 poems that I liked, and I just sent them in, and I was chosen to come and perform at the second gathering.
You remember what those 3 poems were?
It was Shipping Cattle in the Fall, The Man in the Glass, and I don't remember what the third one was, but I probably could if I spent a little time at it. And so I was fortunate enough to get there. I went with a good friend named Jim Schultz. And Jim and I played a lot of music together, and we were both fairly adept at the time. And because I spent a long time not playing music, the last 20-some years, really, I didn't play much music. But back then, we played 2 or 3 days a week, and so felt real comfortable playing. And we got here to Elko, and we knew that the Riders in the Sky and 2 or 3 other people that we were really interested in seeing were going to be the evening performance. And there were 5 tickets left for the one-night show. Back then at Elko, there was one night show, and tickets were $5. And then after that show, everybody got together and they played music up in the kind of ballroom at the Stockmans. And so Jim and I, we were just determined to get 2 of those 5 tickets that were for that evening's performance, because we didn't know if we could get tickets. We didn't know anything except when the gathering was and that we were going to be there and I was going to recite in the daytime sessions. And so when we arrived, we discovered 5 tickets left. So we pulled up 2 chairs, and there was a little, in the convention center, there was a little desk, and that's where these tickets were going to go on sale at 5 o'clock that evening. And so about 2 o'clock that afternoon, Jim and I sat down in front of that desk with 2 chairs, and we just played music, and we just played for 3 hours, waiting for the ticket sales to open up so we could get 2 of those 5 tickets that were left for the evening performance. And as we were playing, people would stop and listen, and they ask if we were a group or if we were here as part of the entertainment. We just said, no, we're just here, and we're waiting for the ticket sales, and so we're just entertaining ourselves with this. And so that was my first year at the gathering, was saying those poems that I mentioned and some others, and just getting exposed to all of the great poetry and music that was happening at the time. And I've actually been to 32 of the 33 Elko National Poetry Gatherings now that we call it. And I just fell in love with everybody's work. I mean, not everybody, of course, but the guys that Ross Knox and Waddy Mitchell and Everett Brizendine and Glenn Orland and there were just all these, Sonny Hancock, and there were Tom Eaton. I was just amazed. And it just got better every year. It got bigger every year. I met you here when you were 18, I think, when you first came to Elko.
I think I was 19 when I first came to Elko, but we may have met before then.
We did in Anson, yeah. And but it really kind of replaced music for me. The poetry did, because I loved the spoken word so much, and it's so much a part of in cow camps or in line shacks like we were in on the West Fork or on ranches, you entertained each other with stories. They didn't have to be rhymed and metered, but if you knew a poem, you shared it with the guys. And Brian Newbert and I were always swapping poems back and forth. The first time I heard Joel Nelson do The House with Nobody in It, Joyce Kilmer poem, we were gathering a pasture of horses in Hawaii, and we had about 125 2 and 3 and yearlings, 2 and 3 year olds and yearlings that we were taking to winter pasture. And Joel and I were mounted on some colts that we had started there that year, and he said, one time Wilford Brimley was down at the 06, and we set out on a gather, and he told me this poem, and then Joel recited The House with Nobody in It to me. So it's like one of my favorite memories of spending time with Joel was that day moving those colts up there on the ranch and hearing a poem I had never heard before. And then I would say one for him and he'd say one for me. And I've been real privileged with Joel to get to be the first guy to hear a lot of his material. We've been good friends for a long time. And J.B. Allen was another poet that I met who used to send me pieces, and it just, for me, the poetry, I just hooked onto it so strongly, and I found that I had a knack for sharing it, and I've talked with Jen about this and others. Wasn't an act, wasn't a performance for me. It's a passion that I love to share with people, and it's conversation. And I love poems and songs that are conversational so that it doesn't have to be a performance, it can be a sharing. And so I've always felt like my role in this whole cowboy thing was I almost do almost exclusively other people's work. And I do a few things of my own and some contemporary pieces that I just think are too good not to do. But I've always felt like I was a messenger, bringing the message that other people wrote, who aren't here to bring that message anymore. And with Bruce Cascadden, with Will Ogilvie, with Henry Lawson, with Charles Badger Clark, they were gone before this renaissance of poetry and music really got going. And so I just loved sharing those things because they meant so much to me. They were so much a rich part of the culture that I have lived and immersed myself in. I love the horses and the gear and all of it, and working the cattle and visiting about it afterwards and all of that stuff. But it has a dimension it would have never had if it hadn't been for the poetry and the music that I got exposed to in these searches through these old books, and then in finding out that I wasn't the only one with the interest. There were guys meeting at Elko and Alpine and other places who were not only memorizing and sharing the old stuff, but were writing good stuff, good contemporary stuff. And so, that was my real exposure to it happened before the gathering started, but the public presentation of it started with the second gathering, and then just has continued on. And I'm not, I still am as passionate about those first poems I learned as I hope I do them better now, but I'm as passionate about those things as I am about the horses and the gear and the excitement of learning to braid a reata from Bill Dorrance, the poetry's never lost its interest for me. The things that I've done in my life that have lasted, they're as attractive right now as they were the first time I made a run at it, whether it's, roping's another thing. I'm way better roper now than I started out being. I hope I'm a better reciter now than I started out being. I hope I'm better at all of it than I started out being. Feel like I've just scratched the surface. Feel like a kindergartner because there's so much to be done, and so the music for me started out with my interest in story song. It moved to story poems. I love free verse too, and I love descriptive poetry, and I have a lot of poems memorized that I never do at a gathering, especially at a cowboy gathering, that I just love the words. I love the sound of the words. I like the way they make me feel, like the ideas they represent. And so it's real fun to know that you and J.B. Allen and Joel Nelson and Wally McRae and Paul Zarzyski, all of those, Vess Quinlan, all of those guys who love the sound of words, Buck Ramsey, Larry McWhorter, Sonny Hancock, we got to be together and share that stuff. And it's made my life so rich. My life was really rich as a working cowboy, and then as a wannabe horseman, and then as a student of horsemanship, and as a student of Brian Newbert and Bill Dorrance and Joe Walter and Billy Askew. Billy taught me more about roping than anybody ever did, and to be as excited about doing that now as I was when I was trying to learn how, it's just made life so much richer. And I would have, if I had never heard cowboy poetry, it'd have been a real shame to miss out on how much it's added to actually living and working as a cowboy. It added a dimension that it would never have if I hadn't been exposed to that. So the guys that Hal Cannon and Jim Griffith and all the folks that got things rolling, this is a huge gift for me. Some of my best friends are fellow lovers of the spoken word who I met them because of that. I didn't meet them because they were good horsemen or because they were good cowpunchers. I met them because they loved the spoken word. And whether it was cowboy poetry or non-cowboy poetry, didn't matter. Didn't matter a bit.
Would you feel like reciting one to kind of wrap up this deal?
Sure. I tell this story, and I told it today, about I'll do an Australian piece that's a tribute to the horse, and I can't do it without thinking about Bill Dorrance, because not only was Bill just an incredible human being, but he's a really good friend. And he didn't care if I ever rode a horse or ever braided a rawhide reata. That didn't matter to him. He would have treated me just the same way as he did, because I had an interest in the things that he was interested in. He's just a magnanimously generous human being, and if you were interested in anything he knew about, he was willing to share that with you. But Bill had something special about the horses that he rode, and other people have something similar, but it just stood out in Bill so much, and that was he really appreciated the horse for what it was, and it wasn't for what it could do for him. He didn't like a horse that could do something great for him and not like one that couldn't. Bill liked them all. He just loved the horse, and he appreciated what it had to offer, and he could get the best out of anything. And I didn't know him in his prime. I only knew him in his old age. But Bill used to say, I was a lot better in my 60s and 70s than I ever was in the prime of my life, because I finally figured out how to get with those horses. And so that gives me a lot of hope that I'll get a piece of what Bill had someday. But this poem is by Will Ogilvie. It's called The Hooves of the Horses. And I just can't help but think about Bill when I think about it, because he was the guy I knew who really appreciated the horse just because he was a horse. So, the hooves of the horses so witching and sweet as the music earth steals from the iron-shod feet. No whisper of lover, no trilling of bird can stir me as hooves of the horses have stirred. They spurn disappointment and trample despair. They drown with their drumbeats the challenge of care. With scarlet and silk for their banners above, they are swifter than fortune and sweeter than love. On the wings of the morning they gather and fly. In the hush of the night time I hear them go by, the horses of memory thundering through with flashing white fetlocks all wet with the dew. When you lay me to slumber, no spot you can choose but will ring to the rhythm of galloping shoes, and under the daisies no grave be so deep, but the hoofs of the horses shall sound in my sleep.
All right, folks, that's it for this episode. I'd like to thank Randy Rieman for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Randy at randyrieman.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to help me keep this show going, you could make a donation on my website, or you could go to the iTunes store and leave a review and a rating and subscribe. That helps a lot more people find the show. And finally, you could just tell a friend about the show. Send them an email, or maybe just tell them in person that this is something they might enjoy listening to. If you have a story or a comment or a question, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.